Hi, I'm Courtney Ross, Director of Creative and Communications at BCU. Welcome to Cultivating Compassion in the Workplace, a book launch and panel discussion. I'm so thrilled to have this tremendous lineup of leaders here with us today, including Donato Tramuto and Tammy Booth Corwin, who together wrote The Double Bottom Line, How Compassionate Leaders Captivate Hearts and Deliver Results. If you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to log into Google or YouTube and pop your question in the chat below. The group will try to answer as many as possible throughout this discussion. Also, this is being recorded, so you can feel free to return here and share and watch the playback as well. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the day, another compassionate leader and good friend of BCU, Jean Chatzky. Jean is CEO of HerMoney.com and host of the podcast Her Money with Jean Chatzky, the financial editor of NBC Today and 25 years and the financial ambassador for AARP. She appears frequently on CNN, MSNBC, and was a recurring guest on The Oprah Winfrey Show. She is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, so is the perfect person to moderate this book panel discussion. Thanks for being here today, Jean. Take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here for this book launch. I'm honored. I'm also very excited and interested in this conversation. Missions versus margins. That is the equation that companies, large and small, are often asked to solve for. How powerful empathy can be when it's deployed correctly. To figure out how powerful empathy can be when it's deployed correctly, Donato Tramuto and his co-writer Tammy Booth Corwin spoke with dozens of strong leaders to ask them how they guide their businesses with compassion and how their respective strategies can actually lead to greater success. They also drew insights from a survey of 1,500 people, which analyzed how exactly leaders use empathy to deliver some seriously impressive results, including making those same leaders happier as well. And so today, to celebrate the publication of the book, The Double Bottom Line, How Compassionate Leaders Captivate Hearts and Deliver Results, we're going to dive into that research, and we're going to do it with an amazing panel of experts featured in the book. Let me introduce them all to you, and then we'll take it away with questions. And let me just echo Courtney's sentiments. We'd love you to participate in this conversation. So if you have a question, just go to the chat and type it in, whether you're watching on YouTube or whether you're watching on Google. So let me begin with introductions. Brad Flugel currently advises healthcare organizations, entrepreneurs, and other participants in healthcare. He was most recently a senior vice president at Walgreens, responsible for all commercial healthcare activities, including sales, contracting, biopharma relationships, retail clinics, clinical affairs, new service development, and market planning. Hey, Brad. Ash Rogers is co-CEO of Luwala Community Alliance, and Luwala matches community-led change with university-backed research and evaluation to advance quality healthcare for all. And its community-led health model has led to reductions in child mortality and increases in skilled delivery rates, increases in contraceptive prevalence, and increases in immunization coverage. Amazing work. Welcome, Ash. Glenn Tullman is CEO of Transcarent. And Transcarent is a new, different, and better health and care experience company for employees of self-insured employers and their families. It empowers consumers with the kind of information, guidance, and access that leads to better care, better outcomes, and more cost-effective decisions for everyone. Mike Valentine is with us. Mike is president and CEO of BCU, one of the fastest growing credit unions in the country. Under Mike's leadership, BCU has grown into a leading financial benefit partner for Baxter International, Target Corporation, Cardinal Health, United Health Group, Geico, HCA Healthcare, and many others, with more than 300 100,000 members and assets of more than $5 billion. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Gene.
Last but certainly not least, we have Tammy Booth Corwin, the writer of this book, also a media strategist, a former publishing executive. She has appeared or been featured in media outlets like the New York Times, Fortune, and CNBC, and was recognized in the Wall Street Journal's 50 Women to Watch. And the man we are all here to celebrate, Donato Tramuto, global health activist and author of The Double Bottom Line. He's the former CEO of Tivity Health, widely recognized for his commitment to social change and transformational leadership in healthcare innovation that led the New York Times to call him a global health activist. Donato and Tammy, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Um, Finally, today we also have Len, and Len is an artist from the Sketch Effect. He's joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, and he is, as you can already see, bringing today's event to life in a visually compelling way. So we can all look forward to watching how that turns out. Donato, let me start with you. What prompted you to write this book, and why did you write it now?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I'd like to just thank all my fellow panelists. Each one of them has lived truly the example of compassion, and so it's really an honor to be here with them. And Gene, I want to thank you for hosting this today. To answer your question, we're living in unprecedented times. Never before in our lifetime has there been such widespread disruption in our daily lives and major shifts in how people work, connect, and solve problems. I still see too much of the old face of leadership in organizations today. This is a top down, hierarchical, the boss has all the answers type of leadership that focuses more on productivity and profit than people. We all have heard the term the great resignation. I'd like to reclassify that. I call it the great reflection. That old leadership doesn't work anymore. Today's workforce is too young, too diverse, and too disengaged, too tired of not being heard and respected. And that's why, quite frankly, we need a new model of leadership, one that is necessarily focused on people and in addition to performance and profit focus. And so it's why I wrote the book to provide a playbook, if you will, that will show leaders how to adopt a more modern, more compassionate leadership style by weaving together research backed advice and real world examples of nearly 41 compassionate leaders that we interviewed. We conducted hundreds of hours of interviews. And interesting, we added to our research of these individuals a survey of 1,500 employees. And so the purpose of me pointing this out, it's not the gospel according to Donato and Tammy. We really dug into the research to uncover how compassionate leaders have been able to succeed and deliver results while putting a soul in the company.
Can we just take a step back, Donato, and let me just follow up with you because I think it's an important question for setting the table. Define compassionate leadership.
Hmm. Well, music to my hearing aids. I'm glad you asked that question because, quite frankly, I'm not so sure I had the right definition going into the writing of this book. And so, what we uncovered in the hundreds of hours of research that compassionate leadership is empathy in action. And so many people will say, gosh, I've been empathetic and they don't do anything. And that's not compassionate leadership. And by the way, I always believe in order to understand the positive part of the definition, you should tear it apart and negate it. And so when a leader lacks empathy, they lose the ability to adapt their approach because they can't see further than their own point of view. And let's look what's happening right now with Ukraine. You have one leader who, quite frankly, has really understood what his people want. President Zelensky has been a true example of compassionate leadership versus the other side that unfortunately is unable to adapt their approach. And so it was really revealing to me to tear this definition apart and to be able to write about it in the book.
Mike, I see you nodding along with Donato. Would you like to add anything to the definition of what compassionate leadership is and maybe what it's not?
Yeah, it's one of those things, Gene, and I think Donato, articulated it very well. You have it or you don't, and you know it if it's there. So how I would take a twist, and I actually took this from Donato, and it's listening to understand. I don't think people do that enough. And Donato's version of, I think it's listening to respond. I say listening to argue. And so many leaders, sometimes you listen to employees, you talk to people, and you're really trying to understand what's happening there. Are you really trying to understand that? Or are you really trying to negate that and kind of argue back with it? So to me, I think it's one of those things, and again, I'll say it again, you have it and you know it when you see it. And it's hard not to be authentic when you have it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tammy, you have devoted more than a year of your time to researching this book and interviewing those leaders, those almost 4 dozen leaders, along with Donato. Were there attributes that you found shared among these compassionate leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, what Mike just mentioned, I would say is probably at the top of the list. Great leaders are great listeners. And, in our research, we see that the majority of workers actually say that they're not listened to, that their bosses do not listen to their input, don't ask for their feedback. And that's an issue. It causes, disengagement, and worse, you miss ideas, you miss solutions. And additional research has shown that if you do listen to your employees and employees feel listened to, they're 4 times more likely to do their best job that they can. So great listening is absolutely, I would say, up there at the top. And we saw that in we saw that in everyone we interviewed and all the research we did. We saw a lot of different characteristics, but the other one I want to mention is vulnerability. And I raise that because it's a more contemporary attribute that we've seen, in kind of the old school leaders. Donato and I sort of dug into what's the difference between some of the old school leaders and compassionate leaders. And one of them is that the old school leader always sort of felt like they had to have all the answers, and had to project a certain strength and command. But what we see now is it's more effective to be more human and be more vulnerable. And that includes things like admitting if you made a mistake, for example, that maybe there's a better way, or maybe that there are other people with input that is as good as or better than your own. And it adds to the mix. So I would say those are 2 of the attributes. And the last thing I'll say is that all of these are learnable, and that was an important point. Not everyone was born with being a compassionate leader. Most of our interviews, most of our leaders told us that they didn't necessarily start out that way.
I want to just follow up on that point because I'm always fascinated when we talk about things like optimism, like resilience, like gratitude, like compassion, that you're born with a certain amount, right? You're born with, I've seen studies that say 50% of these attributes that you're ever going to get, but the rest, the other 50%, is up to you, and you can put your effort into learning it. So how did these leaders learn compassion?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. So I think everyone arrives at that place following a different path. Really, sometimes it was because they went through very difficult circumstances and they understood acutely how other people experience suffering. For some, it was maturity. For some, it was they had a great mentor. And one of the things that in one of our interviews, when we interviewed a public company CEO, he told us that the sort of game changing wisdom that changed how he led was when he learned and understood that there are no winners and losers. So I don't have to make sure that someone else loses in order to win. And when once you understand that, I think compassion comes much more naturally.
Ash, I read your story in the book, and I know you had one of those life-changing experiences that Tammy's talking about. Can you tell us a little bit of your story and how it made you a more compassionate leader?
Sure. So my current role as the co-CEO of Lawala really began more than 6 years ago when I was with another organization. I was the director of operations for an entity called Siegel Family Foundation, where I oversaw a large grant portfolio, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of grantees. And I was really looking to be in a position to to see something grow and to help something scale, and was in a conversation with Lawala about this role. And I was 9 months pregnant. And so I had had multiple rounds of interviews and lots of conversations with the board and with staff. And I received a phone call about my candidacy for the role while I was in labor in an Uber on my way to the hospital in Nairobi. And I got the call this is just my personality. There was a lot of uncertainty bringing a life into the world, and I just needed to know whether or not I was going to get that job. And so I took the call in between contractions and told them that I might let them know anywhere between 10 and 48 hours in the future. And I gave birth several hours later. And I had a great team of Kenyan doctors and nurses who were supporting me. And directly after giving birth to my sweet baby boy, I hemorrhaged postpartum, which is a terrifying experience that happens in a large number of births. And there's really not often very many predictors of whether or not you might hemorrhage postpartum. It's also the leading cause of maternal death. And so I lost a lot of blood. I went hypothermic. I felt like I was dying and fading away. And it was the most profound experience of my life to see this new family that I was creating really feeling like they were slipping away from me. Um, I received excellent care and I recovered. My child and I were both very healthy several days later. Um, and I had given birth in Kenya and was reviewing this opportunity to join an organization that solely focused on maternal survival and child survival. And the leading cause of death in, was,
Please.
oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask that everybody else should just make sure that they're on mute while you're talking. So that's good.
Um, And so, obviously, a really profound experience to come to my life that I felt like was meaningful and purposeful, that it came at the same moment of being able to take this leadership role. And today, one of Lawala's core initiatives is around obstetric hemorrhage. We're currently serving a population of 1.1 million people with our obstetric hemorrhage initiative. And we've just gotten national policy passed earlier this year that's incorporated this key technology called the non-pneumatic anti-shock garment into national guidelines. And we've just finished research that shows that that effort has reduced maternal mortalities by 70%. And I think at the core of that was really understanding deeply and personally the experience of that so many others have.
Yeah, yeah, it's Boy, a horrifying experience, but walking in their shoes, there's almost no other way, right, to get the same amount of knowledge and feeling. Brad, in the book, Donato and Tammy write that particularly in this workforce today, we have to move beyond loyalty and get to trust. So, first of all, why is loyalty something that I think many people would aspire to at the tippy top of the list? Why is loyalty no longer enough? And second, how do you actually get to trust?
Well, your timing is impeccable as an ambulance goes driving by in the background. But loyalty has always struck me as transactional and positional. You're my boss, you're my partner, you're my dog, so I'm loyal to you, and not necessarily something that's earned. And it's also struck me that you can be loyal to somebody and not particularly like them. And trust, I think, is much deeper and earned. I trust you because of who you are. You've earned it by being reliable, being honest, being capable. And I trust you based on my experience with you as opposed to loyalty. And I think it's particularly important today because if you don't have trust, loyalty can lead you to an organizational culture where people aren't honest with you. They aren't telling you the truth. And can lead organizations to do the wrong things. I think Donato mentioned the war in Ukraine, and I think Russia maybe perhaps is an example where there's a lot of loyalty, perhaps, but not any trust, and that leads, I think, leaders to sometimes making some bad choices. So, how do you get there? I think you earn it by your actions and not words, or because of the role that you have. And I think an important component of that is being real, acknowledging your mistakes when you make them, and to treat people as human beings as opposed to just a cog in an organizational hierarchy that's there to accomplish a task. And I think that building that kind of trust gets you rewarded both in terms of loyalty to some extent, but I think more importantly, better organizational performance and better outcomes for your organization.
So Glenn, take that a step further for me, if you would, and draw a line between trust and compassion. Why is trust such an important ingredient in compassion? And are there other ingredients that you believe are key in this recipe?
Yeah, I think when I think of loyalty, I think in many respects of blind loyalty, people following and saying, you have to be loyal. And I think trust is more of an ongoing, it's a verb. You build trust, you have trust, you continue to earn trust. So from that perspective, I think trust is much more valuable. I also think we're in a new environment. Before you were together with people, you could get to know them a lot better. And, now I think we're going to move from this idea, we used to hear this phrase, culture eats strategy for lunch, but now culture isn't going to be enough because, what is culture? We're going to have something beyond culture. And that is that sense of trust. Can I really trust you when push comes to shove? And I think that's that whole sense back to the book about empathy. And that is, do people really understand who you are? And will they be there for you? Can you trust them? And that's really important. We talk about trust in a very different way than I think we do loyalty. So, I just to go back to one other point, I think many people, like Ash was saying, have gone through some kind of experience that allowed them to really get this sense of empathy. And so that weakness, that lowest point becomes their highest point because they've developed a new sense of understanding, a new sense of empathy. So I think that's true of a lot of great leaders have had a very low point that they had to build back from and spring back from.
Did
Did
that happen to you? Did
Yeah,
that happen to you?
I think I've been fortunate. One, I've been blessed with a lot of wonderful mentors, but also some life challenges along the way. And I've Donato knows this story, but when I went back to my little university in Pennsylvania where I went, and I went back and I'd had some business success, and a professor said, "How do you think you're doing?" And I had just done an IPO, and I said, "Oh, I think I'm doing pretty well." And so he was quiet. And I said, "Why are you quiet?" And he said, "Well, we didn't educate you to make money. We educated you to make a difference. And I'm disappointed." And that was a real turning point. I'm almost getting emotional right now talking about it. It's a real turning point in my life. And not long thereafter, my youngest son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I think those two things went together, and it helped fuel my passion for healthcare. That paired with working with other empathetic people like Donato, and we worked together. We had the great fortune of working together, and I saw someone who was in his early days a very unique leader, and I learned a lot from him along that path as well.
Donato, what flipped the switch for you? What was your moment or moments along the way that brought you to this point?
Well, thank you for asking, and Glenn, thank you for sharing your story. And I certainly do agree that we all have had experiences. We all have stories. For me, it was 9/11. As many of my colleagues know, I was scheduled to be on the second flight that hit the South Tower. I got off because of a toothache. I went out the day before. My two friends and their 3-year-old unfortunately remained on that flight and lost their lives when the plane hit the South Tower. And that was a changing moment in my life. Certainly, I realized that I could have gone down a different path. I could have had anger and hatred in my heart, and I think people would have been probably understanding that. And it made me realize the shortness of life and the reality that we all have stories. And I have been very focused on pulling stories out of people. And I want to go back to what somebody said about trust. And Glenn, you said it perfectly, and I say this in the book. And I know I've shocked a lot of leaders. Culture doesn't come first anymore. How do you get the culture if you don't get the trust? And you have to take the time to build that trust. And from that experience, what I realized is that I am so happy that I had this dinner with my friends the night before. At my home, we were breaking bread and we were talking and laughing. And I heard their stories about their adopted son. They were a gay couple. They were one of the first to adopt a baby back in 1999. And so it made me realize that if stories are important in the personal side of our lives, they're equally as important on the professional side. People don't leave their lives on their front steps when they leave their homes and go to work. And that changed my philosophy of getting to know people. And I'll just share with you one story. When I became the CEO of Healthways at the time, Glenn knows this, we had two divisions. One was losing a lot of money, one was making a lot of money. Well, I was born at night, but not last night. I knew what to do. I had to find a way to move that other division out. And I could have shut it down. The market would have rewarded me. But I spent 6 months meeting with more than 2,000 employees one-on-one, sending them thank you notes afterwards, hearing their passion about that division that wasn't performing. And we did something that, Glenn, I don't know if it's ever been done before. We paid a company to take the division. We paid them. Now imagine going to your board and saying, after you put $1 billion in this division, we can't get $1 for it. Let's pay a company to take the division. However, what I accomplished is I listened to the employees. We didn't have one chaos on the day that we made that announcement. The stock, Brad, right? The stock doubled that day. We saved 1,500 jobs, and that division now is part of ShareCare, doing very well. And so that really is what Michael said, listening to understand. Don't listen to react. That's how I built the trust with those employees, listening to their stories.
I want to just, if I can, I want to just emphasize one thing Donato said, and that is that we have an artificial distinction and we talk about work-life balance. And I think that's wrong. I think that what we should have is work-life prioritization. But the fact of the matter is we should be passionate and love everything we do. And we shouldn't draw this artificial distinction, and we shouldn't not have relationships with people at work and have close relationships outside of work. The stronger, more personal relationships are at work, the better your work will go, the more successful your business will be. And I think one point Donato makes very well is that empathy is not soft, it's hard. It means if you have an empathetic leader and an empathetic company, you're going to make more profit. You're going to be more successful. Sometimes people think of it as the opposite, but in fact, look at the great companies. Those people are passionate about those companies.
One last point, if I may just add, there's a line in the book by Tasunda Brown Duckett. You probably know Tasunda. She is the CEO of TIA. I've known her through my work at the Robert F. Kennedy Center. We serve on the board. But she said something that was profound. You rent your title. You own your dignity. And that is what compassionate leadership is all about. It's not about having titles. It's about showing that commitment to people. And Glenn, you said it well. When people used to ask me the question, how do you balance your life personally and professionally? And I said, I don't. They're integrated. And if employees can go home and talk about the soul that you put into the company, Glenn has been great at this in terms of his commitment to finding a cure for diabetes. We have done this through the launch of Healthy Villages in the organization. If they can go home and talk about something that has been passionate in their professional lives, there's no such thing as you've got to separate personal from professional. They get integrated in a way where you have great passion.
Yeah, it's remarkable when you can find that in your life. It's hard to find, I think, sometimes, but when you latch onto it, you should really make an effort to keep it. Mike, in the book, Donato describes asking you how you managed through the pandemic. We've all had a couple of years, right? And you responded, compassionate leadership in action. Could you bring that to light with an example or two?
Sure. Thanks, Gene. And again, Donato, big shout out to Donato and Tammy. This has been a fun project to work with, and Donato is an inspiration to so many of us. And Gene, you're such a good friend to the credit union. Thanks for doing this. So I would start with, for me, it was probably some of the darkest days in the beginning because I said it in the book and I mean it. All of a sudden I had 800 family members, and then you multiply that times 2, you had a lot of people you're responsible for. So to me, the first thing that I thought was most important was connecting with employees and making sure they're good and making sure how they're doing, how are their homes, how are their daycare, how are they taking care of people. And I think the other thing that I learned, and it's kind of fun when I think about it, Gene, because it's a lesson I practice today. Was in the old days, the office, we have an office facility here. We have 175,000 square feet of office, 600 employees that come to work every day. I could probably count maybe 150 that are in today. The old days, I could walk around and talk to people. I could walk around and see them, touch them, feel them, except the people that were out in the branches. And all of a sudden, I'm home by myself, staring at a screen, by myself, by the way, with my family. And I'm like, man, I'm disconnected. So to me, I started immediately checking in with people, one-on-one calls. Sometimes there were 15 minutes, sometimes 30 minutes. And most of the calls were just about how you doing, and then it's like, so first of all, to me, stabilize the employee workforce. And then it's turned to the members. Gene said we have 300,000 members across the United States and Puerto Rico. And these companies we work with are large companies, and they're coming to us saying, hey, how do you help our employees? So one of the things that we coined very fast, and it was a great rallying point for our employees, we were the financial first responders to our 300,000 members. What can we do to help them right now. You know, we deferred loans. The good news is with a credit union, we're nonprofit, not for loss, but we're nonprofit, so we could do some things, and our board of directors rallied behind this. You know, we deferred and, you know, absorbed fees to the tune of almost $16 million for our members. And not many publicly traded companies can do that, but we can. You know, and I tell you what, we did it because it was the right thing to do, but we're bearing that fruit now with loyalty, trust from our membership that says, wow, you guys were there. So to me, it's being there and it's trying to understand. And I go back to the beginning, the listening and the listening posts that you set up in a company, but it all starts with the employees. You know, and I think if you take care of the employees and you make them feel comfortable with where they are, you will get a great workforce that takes care of your company for you.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Donato, we got a question from the audience, and let me just say that if anybody watching has a question, the way to get it to me is just put it in the chat, and it will funnel its way right to my computer. How important is it to show yourself compassion as a leader, and how do you learn to do that?
I'm so appreciative that that question has come in, because one of the questions that we added to our slate of questions for each leader, and I think we in many respects shocked them, we asked them how they show themselves compassion. And so it first begins, and I think Tammy used this word earlier, it begins first with feeling comfortable about sharing who you are, being vulnerable. I remember for many years, I kept it from people that I'm a gay man as a CEO in healthcare, as a CEO of a public company. That is not necessarily something you feel comfortable sharing. But I remember in 2014, along Glenn Tillman received it in 2019. I had received the Robert F. Kennedy Ripple of Hope Award alongside Hillary Clinton and Tony Bennett. It was a magical evening, and I was going to go up there with 300 of my employees and never mention about my partner. And I said to myself, what is wrong with this picture? I'm receiving a Human Rights Award and I'm not sharing with my employees. And I got up there and I introduced my partner, and how foolish of me. Afterwards, the employees came to me and said, oh my God, it makes you more interesting. I thought you lived a boring life. You have an interesting life. It was kind of funny. But you have to be willing to accept who you are and be willing to share that with the employees. And then be willing to say to the employees, I have a family. I'm struggling with this situation in my life, and I want to share it with you. And the more we're willing to do that, I think we make it okay for ourselves to take the time to refuel those batteries that need charging every so often. And so I learned it the hard way, thinking that people cared about things that I thought were so important to me. And quite frankly, they don't. They want to know that you have as much of humanity in your life that they have in theirs. And so those who are listening, you need to take the time for yourself. You need to take the time to do the things that are important to you. And your colleagues are going to understand it.
Brad, let me follow up with you, because in the book you told Donato that a lot of compassionate, successful people are harder on themselves than a lot of people, and that this is something that you have worked on with yourself. You've worked on it personally. How did you do that, and how do you suggest that we do it?
Yeah, you know, it's true. I mean, I did not used to be a very compassionate leader. My mantra was, my engagement strategy was, I pay you, you work. What else do you need to talk about? But I think that some of that just came from how, you know, I was raised, how I was brought up, and how you know, how hard I was on myself to be perfect. And I think a lot of executives are that way as they're growing up and coming up, because they don't want to make a mistake. They feel like it might have an adverse impact on their relationships and prospects for promotion. But I think I came to the conclusion that And I think Donato says this in the book. It's hard if you don't feel compassion for yourself. It's going to be hard for you to feel compassion for other people. And my story was not nearly as traumatic as Ash's, but my story was getting fired from a job, from a big deal job, and I'd never had that experience of failure before, and that sort of just taught me that I'm more than that. That I'm more than that job. I'm more than my professional profile, and that I need to treat myself better and share more of myself with other people. Um, and so I think a lot of it is being more generous with yourself, understanding that I think somebody mentioned it earlier. Sometimes leaders think they have to have all the answers and not rely on other people necessarily because they view that as weakness. And I think a lot of folks that were leaders 20 years ago were that way. But I think that if you are compassionate with yourself, you treat other people with compassion, you'll get that acceptance, and it sort of rewards itself, right? It's like, oh gosh, I told somebody I screwed up, and it's not the end of the world. They still seem to trust me and like me, and maybe even like me more. The other thing, just on this other point on sharing, I was not brought up that way. I was brought up to be very self-contained. I moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I spent a lot of time in my own head, in my own life. And sharing that was not an easy thing for me to learn. It was not an easy skill to learn. But I think as I matured and understanding that to be comfortable with that sharing also helps to kind of break down those walls against compassion and empathy.
I also think it gets easier with practice, right? We share once, and the world
Mhm.
doesn't fall apart. So maybe we share again, and maybe we share again, and over time, like talking about so many difficult subjects, it becomes easier. Tammy, there are a lot of business leaders in this book, but I'm wondering if compassionate leadership is just for business leaders, or where else you think it has an important place.
Yeah, sure. So we did interview a lot of business leaders. We also interviewed people who, had positions like Ash, who are out, doing amazing things to help people in a nonprofit or an NGO setting. People in education. One of our favorite interviews was with a nun who was probably the toughest person we interviewed in the book, and she was a homeless advocate. Um, Recently I gave the book to my friend who's a writer, doesn't work she's just an independent writer. And she called me and said, I can't stop reading this. And I'm not sure why it's resonating so strongly with me because I don't manage anyone. And what Donato and I found, and I think is true, is that we're all leaders or aspiring leaders or can be leaders in our own lives, in our communities, and in our families even. And so it's important to think about how we impact others with our actions.
Yeah, Ash, I was wondering, I'm glad Tammy brought you up because I was wondering if you could give us an example or two of how it's not just for business leaders, how you've applied this sort of leadership in your world.
That's really this direction of the conversation is really resonating with me. And in particular, I think that highly motivated people, people who have a lot of anxiety about how they want to change the world, there's often this perfectionism that's inside of you, and that and can drive you maybe early in your career and early in your journey, but it really becomes the enemy of progress, because what perfectionism tells us is there's some standard that I have to reach, and if I fall short, now I feel shame and I feel um, frozen in that inability to achieve what I had set out to, rather than being able to have a growth mindset and tell ourselves, I'm just not done, right? Like, I have a big dream I'm trying to achieve. There's a huge world with all sorts of complicated problems, and I'm on my way to become a better person internally, to give myself compassion, and also on a journey of learning and discovery. And I think that also helps us have a more collectivist mindset rather than an individualistic mindset. And really, to solve any of the world's challenges, there's not one company, there's not one nonprofit that's going to make that happen. What we need is movement building and collectivism that allows us to move together. And that really, the building movements is also rooted in compassion.
Ash, if I
Donato,
may
you want to?
just,
Yeah.
yeah, if I may just reinforce this, and I think Tammy's going to put a big smile on. We never saw this as a book. We saw this as a movement. I'm very pleased to share with all of you. We're in the, finishing hours of getting this done, but we have an organization in Washington that's going to purchase the book for every congressman, congresswoman, senator. They want Tammy and I to put a training program on. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Despite what branch you might be in and what political party you might be associated with, that we approach these issues with more compassion and understanding. We have such great discourse in our family as the result of the last 4 or 5 years. How can we get our families back at the dinner table to understand that we don't have to yell and scream and call somebody a jerk? And so this is not just a business book. I've never seen any debate ever won by calling somebody a jerk, you're stupid, or screaming at them. It's been really won by having a conversation. We're having too many versations. So this is not just a business book. I don't want to disappoint the business leaders who are here. This is really a book for all people and for all seasons.
Tammy, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I just would say here, here. We're pretty excited about everything we're seeing in terms of people being excited about the message, and we just think it's time.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like it's beyond time, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Glenn, I work in the world of personal finance, where it's often seen as not passionate because there's a ton of lingo and a lack sometimes of transparency. Work in another one of those worlds, not just healthcare, but health insurance. Talk to me about the connection between compassion and understanding and how providing people with information that they can understand is a compassionate act.
Well, I think that, we're fortunate working in healthcare that we start with an advantage. And that advantage is there's nothing more important than healthcare, our health. It's not money, it's not finance, it's not anything other than the health of ourselves and our families. And the second thing I'd say is that there more than ever, if there was any good that came from this pandemic we've all been through together, it's a sense of essential workers, it's a sense of the inequality, particularly in healthcare. And, we've all heard the stories that if you're Black or if you're Hispanic, your likelihood of dying, your likelihood of being hospitalized is dramatically higher. We've all learned the zip code, that 2 or 3 zip codes away from where I live in Chicago, the length of your life can be 8 to 10 years less. And so as we start to come to grips with these disparities, I think ideally, at least for a large part of the population, we're starting to understand that we're all in this together. And, that is, I think, the greatest form of empathy. So in our business, it's about how do we get more care to more people? How do we eliminate? And I was just on at a conference talking about this. If you look at healthcare in America, the number one cause of bankruptcy in America is healthcare. And it all has to do with copays and coinsurance. And the whole concept of a copay, we also know that the higher the copay, and Brad knows this from his experience, the higher the copay, the less people pick up the script. So who does that hurt? It hurts people with less money. This is a discriminatory practice. We have to, all of us have the responsibility to start to call this out. say healthcare is a right. It's something Donato, I've heard him say 100 times. Healthcare is a right, and we all need it, particularly, I think, all over the world, but in a country as wealthy as ours, we have to get to that point. And once again, every one of these factors, if we make healthcare a right, we make our country stronger, we make our businesses more productive. This is a business issue. It's not just a compassion issue. I don't separate those two. So again, these artificial separations. So, I feel very fortunate to work in healthcare. I can't talk about this without a shout out to the amazing healthcare professionals who brought us through this pandemic, the nurses, the doctors, the other healthcare professionals who got us through this, who continue to get us through this at great risk to themselves and their families. And so we have so many pieces, and now our task is to put them together. There's one other point I want to make, and it references the earlier question, and that is that we focus so much on division. I'm very proud of a former coworker who left his job as CEO of a very successful company after 10 years and just launched something called In Common. And the whole concept that he has and that he's building is this idea that if we focus on what we have in common, not what divides us, we'll be so much stronger together. And I couldn't be more excited about what he's building. And just to use an example of that, he talks about if you take a room of Trump supporters on one side and AOC supporters on the other, those people really don't like each other. And then you say, how many of you have lost a parent? And you put that group together. How many of you have a child with an illness? Put that group together. All the political stuff goes out the window. And all of a sudden, those people are so close because of that shared experience. That's empathy at work. And so I'm hopeful that books like the one that we're talking about today are going to bring more understanding of that and bring us closer together.
Yeah, from your mouth. I think we're all in total agreement on that. Um, as we come closer to the top of the hour, there's a question that's been on my mind, and it's this, and I'd love all of you to answer it. So we'll go around the horn. As a leader myself, I know that there are times when I am not my best self. There are times when I say things or do things that have not been particularly compassionate, things that I would like to take back. How do you react when you know that you failed to show compassionate leadership in a particular situation? Um, and Glenn, let's start with you.
Well, I think, it really relates to this idea of vulnerability. We all make mistakes. We're never our best selves all the time. And when you make them, call them out. We do that a lot. There's this saying that says, correct in private, praise in public. We do the opposite. We try to make sure that we're vulnerable to say, if somebody made a mistake, talk about it, call it out so other people don't make the same one. And if somebody won, we don't say, oh, reward that salesperson, they sold a big deal. No, the whole company sold it. So we celebrate together as a team, and we try to be vulnerable and demonstrate that. And there's nothing better than a leader who says, I made a mistake. Nothing at all. It makes it so much easier for the rest of the company to be humans, as Donato was talking about. And I think that's, at the end of the day, that's what people want. They want to know you're just like them. You're no different than they are. And then lastly, treating everybody the same. That we've got to get to that point where we don't build in these artificial distinctions. Everybody's important. We got to treat them that way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Mike, same question.
Yeah, I thought Glenn really said it well. I had a moment, in fact, another one of Donato's books, a bulldozer moment, for me, it was during the pandemic, and as CEO, I was meeting with the ERGs, which are the Employee Resource Group, and one of the groups was the African American ERG. And it was just the start of George Floyd, and things were starting to get really a lot of riots. Chicago, as you know, was a center of a lot of this. And I would sit with this group, and I have to admit it, I wasn't my best self to understand really what they were going through and what it meant. And, so they called a special meeting just with me, and I had a lot of my, peers with me. And I tell you what, it was the worst 90 minutes of my life, but it was the best 90 minutes of my life because it taught me, one, to Glenn's point, own it. Two, show vulnerability. Three, be transparent, and admit to it. I think of that moment often, and as I lead later, I'll think of that a lot when we're in that. But to me, own it and react to it and be quick about it. And I think to me, that's the key, of having it. And all of us have had them, and I'm with Glenn. I tell you what, I probably make a mistake every day with some of this stuff. It's just, what do we do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. Ash? Can't hear you. Can you talk now? We'll come back to you. We can't hear you. I don't know what's going on with the audio. But I feel pretty good that we've gotten through almost an hour and this is our first glitch. So not to jinx us or anything. Brad, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a lot to add to what Glenn and Mike said, but admit it, accept it, apologize, and that helps to build trust, as we were talking about before. There's nothing worse than somebody doing something wrong or inappropriate or not compassionate or whatever it might be, and not admitting it. That sort of destroys trust. It's the opposite of that because people see it, people know it. And I think to do it as quickly as you can. I mean, I think we all know, at least I do, when I say something or do something that I think is not in the spirit of compassionate leadership. Maybe it's my old Italian Catholic upbringing, but it hits me in the gut right away. That's a bad thing I just did. I need to fix it as soon as possible. And I think, again, as I said, that's super important because it does help build the trust that we're all trying to build.
Ash, do we have you back?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
We do. Yay.
Oh, great. What I was trying to say before is that I think it can be really easy to feel like or to forget that leadership actually takes skills and that many of those skills can be learned. And I've benefited so much from executive coaches and mentors who've actually helped me build skills. And one of those is this concept of the most generous interpretation versus the least generous interpretation. And often when I've faltered as a leader, it's that I've taken someone's behavior or actions and assigned the least favorable interpretation of those actions. And if instead I can pause and think about what instead would be the very most generous way to interpret that action, I'm often able to come back not just with a more empathetic or compassionate approach, but actually one that ends up being more effective in achieving our organization's goals and in achieving my goals.
I love that. I'm going to steal that and use it often. Tammy and Donato, as we wrap up the hour, I'd love to give you guys the last word. Tammy, you first.
Yeah, well, I think that what everyone has shared today has been an incredibly valuable contribution to the conversation. And, as Donato and I have talked about so many times, our commitment is to continue this conversation. And, every day it is a practice. So we continue it and try to share it with everyone. And I feel very grateful to have been part of it and work with Donato, who I've learned a lot from.
Well, let me send that right back. Send that right back to Tammy. It's amazing. We've been an office spouse for 2 years, and it's been really a wonderful experience. I will simply leave you with this message, and it tailgates off of the great question you asked. We make mistakes sometimes. The twin sister to vulnerability is self-reflection. And I'm sure my colleagues here, every night when I went to bed, and I have behind me about 8 books that I would write down that day what I did wrong. And I remember one case at Tivity Health that I was on a plane and we had a conference call with my executives. And this one executive was being a little bit too aggressive. And I had to finally correct her. And the doors closed on the plane. And I felt bad that I had corrected her in front of all those people. I went to bed that night and wrote down what I could have done better. And I could have done a lot better in the way I handled it. And I called her the next morning. I apologized to her. And she immediately apologized to me. We both were in tears. And so you have to self-reflect on your day. I believe it was Socrates who once said the unexamined life is not worth living. And so we have to examine our lives as leaders, not in a month, every single day. And that's how I think you get better at this.
Well, I have learned so much over the course of the last hour. Thank you all for being here. Thanks everybody for watching. Mike, Brad, Glenn, Ash, Tammy, Donato. It was a total pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.